Hello, and welcome to our special presentation of how the economy of the future is impacting us now, presented by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Thank you all for attending today. The Rockford Area Economic Development Council has recognized and reacted to serve our region in the best way we can to support our community efforts to recover, respond, and reimagine how our local business and manufacturers can successfully re-engage our economy. Please take time to reference the RAEDC website for additional reopen support and direction. Without question, 2020 has been one of the most challenging years for business. Unlike the Great Recession, the pandemic of 2020 has affected everything normal about our lives. From our personal life to our business life, everything has changed. For many in business community, we have struggled with the question, what next? Mitigation efforts, supply chain disruption, and unemployment have led to a great deal of uncertainty. With today's presentation, we hope to help answer that question, what next, for you. Undoubtedly, 2021 and 2022 will be transformed financially and economically by this pandemic. The RAEDC is excited to welcome Thomas Wahlstrom, Senior Business Economist from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, to discuss the current economic situation for the state of Illinois as well as our region. He will also talk about forecasts for the US and our local economies. About our presenter, Thomas Wahlstrom is a senior business economist in the Economic Research Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. His responsibilities include the 7th District's contribution to the Beige Book, the Chicago Fed Survey of Business Conditions, the Midwest Economy Index, and briefings for the Chicago Fed President on 7th District economic conditions. He also is a contributing author to the bank's Midwest Economy blog. Wahlstrom holds a BA in economics from Wheaton College, Illinois, and a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois, Chicago, with concentrations in labor, urban, and regional economics. Before we get started, at the end of the presentation, Thomas Wahlstrom will answer questions. Please submit your questions through the chat box function. I will read those questions at the end of the presentation. And now, with great pleasure, I would like to introduce Thomas Wahlstrom. Tom?
Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. Very good, I'm gonna put it in presentation mode. Everything look good, Jared? Okay, I think everything looks good.
Yes,
okay,
I apologize.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, no problem. Great, thanks for the introduction, Jared. Yeah, so I'm Thomas Wahlstrom, and as Jared said, I work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and I'm in the regional group, which, again, in my introduction, it referred to the work in the regional group for the Chicago Fed is to focus on the economy for the Chicago Fed's district, which covers the states of Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So pretty much the heart of the Midwest, except for, I think you could argue that Ohio is definitely part of the heart of the Midwest as well. So my job is to keep track of the Midwest economy for our bank president as he works on decision making related to the interest rate for the economy. And one of the things I do, which I'll be advertising a little bit later, is I conduct, and I think it's in my bio that Jared read, we conduct a survey called the Chicago Fed Survey of Business Conditions. And this survey is a survey of business leaders in the 7th Federal Reserve District, and that of course includes Rockford. And what we do is it's a monthly survey, and we just ask people how their businesses are doing in terms of sales and employment and capital spending, and other kind of, we'll have special questions sometimes as well that are topical. But the idea is to provide us with information, boots on the ground perspective of what's going on in our district. And this information, we publish aggregate results on our website, but we also, the comments that come through, the anecdotes that come through get fed up to the Chicago Fed's leadership and help inform policy. So I'm going to ask that any of you who are on the line today who are willing to fill out our survey on a monthly basis. It takes about 15 minutes. If you're a business leader with operations in the 7th Federal Reserve District, which I'm confident many of you are, it'd be great to have you give me feedback, even as I give you some information today from my perspective. We very much value the perspective of business leaders in our area. And so with that, I'll actually be showing you one set of results from the most recent survey, which was for the month of October, a little bit later on. It's going to be forecast what people in the survey are, how people in the survey are forecasting the U.S. economy at the moment. One other thing to note before I get started is that it's the pandemic, and my family just got a kitten earlier this week. The kitten's sitting in my lap, so if you hear any like meows or I suddenly make a noise because I got bitten, it's the cat. Everything's okay. It's nice to have a lap cat these days for sure as I sit at my computer and look at numbers. So oh yeah, one other thing to note is that please do send questions to Jared, and I've told Jared he can interrupt me whenever he feels it's appropriate to ask questions as we go along, and I'll definitely be available for questions afterward as well. So with that, let's get started. So this is the first thing that I generally show people when I'm talking about the current state of the economy. And there we go. Yeah, so, and what this is it's a summary measure of the current state of the US economy. Now, there are many, many measures of the current state of the US economy. And one of the things that we ran into when the pandemic started was that the measure that is most comprehensive, GDP, just didn't come out on a regular enough basis for us to be able to keep track of what's going on. So we have other indicators we look at besides GDP. GDP comes out on a quarterly basis. We have other indicators we look at as well that have come out on a monthly basis, like the monthly jobs report, the unemployment rate comes out on a monthly basis. But at the beginning of the pandemic, even monthly data took too long for us to really be able to get an idea of what was going on. And so what some folks at the New York Fed did is they worked with some academic economists and put together a weekly economic index. So this is where they're taking, this index takes 10 weekly indicators. One particularly prominent indicator that comes out on a weekly basis is the unemployment insurance claims. They take the 10 or so weekly indicators and summarize them with one number, and then they scale it to be in terms of GDP, kind of year-over-year GDP growth. So that's what I'm showing you here. It's the New York Fed's weekly economic index. It's in percent terms, and it's in GDP growth units. So let me interpret the index for you, and then we can talk about what we're seeing here. So you can see that it kind of at if you look at the far right, you can see right at the bottom of the pandemic recession, the number was about -12. And what that meant, what that means, -12 means that if economic activity continued at the -12 pace for a quarter, we'd expect the GDP to be 12% lower than it was the year before. So that's what a -12 means. And so you can see that we weren't at -12 for very long. We were at -12 at the very worst. Activities picked up since then. And what that means is that when we actually got the GDP number for the second quarter of this year, I believe it was about -8% or -9%, something around there. For the year-over-year percent change in GDP. So GDP was in second quarter of 2020 was about 9% lower than it was in the second quarter of 2019. And so you can see that I think that means this weekly index was doing pretty well. If you kind of averaged the index values over the second quarter of the year, this index values, I think you get pretty close to -9. You can see that since the second quarter, we've continued to see a recovery, the recovery take hold. Now, the recovery started quickly, very quickly. the hole is huge and growth is slowing. Now it's still, there are all these letter shapes that people talk about with this recovery. If you look at this chart, it does kind of look like a V, but it's I think it's more likely as things play off. We have seen the growth rate slow. It seems like it's going to be more kind of a swoosh, perhaps, I think is one thing I've heard people refer to it as what you might see. So we've been seeing growth slow, even though it still looks a lot like a V at the moment. So now let's compare it to the Great Recession. The Great Recession is from the far left of this chart. It's the 2008 to 2012, or sorry, 2008 to 2010 is when we were kind of in negative territory here. And you can see that the Great Recession was this current recession was far faster in its drop and much larger. Now, however, there's hope, and I'm going to go over some forecasts at the end of this. There's hope that we're going to be done with this recession sooner than the Great Recession. We're going to be back to normal sooner than it took to get out of the Great Recession, which is good. We also, I'm sure you all are aware, we got some good news on a vaccine earlier this week. So hopefully, from what I can tell, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but from what I can tell, it seems like we're on track for that vaccine and perhaps some other vaccines to be widely available by maybe the second half of next year. So this is where we are. Now, let me back off from just showing you some numbers, and let's talk about kind of a framework, a macro 101 perspective on the pandemic recession. And I think this is useful for it's useful for me. This is how I think about things in general. You can definitely get way more, intense in how you want to model the economy, but I think macro 101 works pretty well for understanding what's going on and how this recession is different from prior recessions. So kind of the big question whenever you have a recession is this a supply shock or a demand shock? So supply and demand, if you've ever studied any economics at all or even read about economics, you've probably heard about supply and demand. That's the first thing that you get taught in your econ or your micro or macro 101 class. And supply and demand, if you're thinking in terms of a business, it's supply is what you make and demand is what people, how much people buy from you. But we want to think about this at the aggregate level, at the level for the whole economy. And it's possible to do that. That's what we do in Macro 101. So let's talk about the supply side. The supply side is the capacity of an economy to produce goods and services. So this is sometimes called potential GDP. And the idea is, let's think about all the businesses in the entire US economy. Think about all that they are capable of producing if they're running at kind of full speed, not overheating, but running at full speed, long-term full capacity, how much stuff can be produced, how many goods and services can be produced. That's the supply side. That depends on population, technology, institutions, and we generally expect this to have kind of a slow, steady growth, especially driven by kind of technological change. The demand side is people's willingness to consume what's being produced. And so this is, there's all this stuff out there. Are people actually going and buying what's being made? Okay, so, most recessions are largely demand driven. And let's see here, no, I don't have a point for the example, but the example I give is, think of the Great Recession, right? So there was a financial crisis, but a big part of the story was the housing bubble. And with the housing bubble, we have the main story that's been told is that there was a big ramp up in home prices, and that created a whole bunch of wealth for people. And when you're feeling more wealthy, you spend more. And when the housing bubble burst, all of a sudden people realized they didn't have the wealth they thought they did, and they cut back on spending. All right, so that's a demand story there, where a big drop in wealth or perceived wealth results in people pulling back on their spending. Didn't change at all what the economy was capable of producing. It simply people stopped spending all at once, and that's where we get a recession. There was also the financial side of the crisis that we're actually thankfully not going through this time, it seems, at least not yet. The financial side of the crisis also caused a big freeze in businesses being able to borrow and spend. Okay, so most recessions are largely demand driven, but this recession's different. It's the way I think of it is that it's simultaneously both a negative supply shock and a negative demand shock. And the example I give is to think of a restaurant. So a restaurant would be a microcosm of the economy, right? So on the supply side, with the pandemic, restaurants have had to pull back on their capacity. They've had to cut down to maybe 25 or 50% of indoor service, and now with this most recent outbreak, at least in Illinois, we're looking at basically no indoor dining is my understanding. I haven't done any indoor dining since the pandemic hit. I'm guessing many of you haven't either. So on the supply side for a restaurant, it's pulling back in what the restaurant is essentially able to produce because it can't serve as many customers in an hour as it used to be able to. But then there's the demand side, which is people like me who I take out still, but it's just not gonna, it doesn't feel relaxing for me to go into a restaurant and sit indoors with other people that are not in my household. So I've pulled back on my demand for restaurant for eating at restaurants. And so the question is, which one's stronger? Now, what we would see if it was primarily a supply shock is that we'd see, even with restaurants having limited capacity, big lines out the door. We'd see, and with big lines out the door, in the inability of restaurants to seat everyone, we should be seeing prices at restaurants going up. If there's big demand for your product, but you can't produce enough, you start raising the price to ration the demand. Okay, so that's what we'd be seeing if it was primarily supply shock. If it was primarily a demand shock, we should see empty restaurants, even though they're at limited capacity, and we should see restaurants dropping prices to try to get people to come in at all. From what I can tell, it seems like for restaurants, it's about the same, both supply and demand, although I think it depends a lot on the restaurant. We have also seen a lot of restaurants have to close down, which would largely be a demand issue, I think. Okay, so but what about for the economy as a whole? The way we determine whether it's primarily a supply shock or demand shock is we look at inflation. Inflation should be getting stronger, going up if it's primarily a supply shock, and it should be we should be seeing deflationary pressure if it's primarily a demand shock. And what we're seeing is that inflation has slowed. It's picked up some in the last few months, but it's still below kind of the Fed's goal of 2%. And we actually just switched this to being an average of 2% is our goal now over an extended period of time. So inflation is below where we want it to be. It's been low for a while, and our goal now is to get inflation to be slightly above 2% for a while. And what this means, if you if this macro 101 framework does a decent job at reflecting reality, what this means is that we're primarily seeing a demand shock going on, more so than a supply shock for the economy as a whole. Okay, so what has the federal government done? Well, the Fed has lowered interest rates to zero, just like we did during the Great Recession. We expect them to be there for a long time, at least through, I think, 2023 is my understanding at the moment. We expect interest rates to be very low. The expectation is that interest rates aren't going to come up until we're very close or maybe even at 2% inflation. And so the Fed's lowered borrowing costs, but the other thing, and I think arguably an even bigger intervention, was the CARES Act, which did a lot to put money in businesses and households' pockets. And those are all with the intention of stimulating demand. But one of the problems we've seen, and this might be going away this is probably going away some as the money from the CARES Act has been dispersed for a while now, and there's probably going to be another stimulus package coming down the line from Congress. Not clear when, but at the moment, one of the reasons that I think you can see that inflation hasn't picked up, even though there's been all this demand stimulus from both the Fed and and Congress is that businesses and households, many of them, are holding cash. Not every household, of course, not every business, of course. Some businesses have shut down and some households are really struggling. But across the aggregate economy as a whole, businesses and households have been doing a lot of saving actually during this time, saving the money they got from the government. And savings not, of course, bad, but it's also not going to drive consumption. It's not consumption which is going to result in increased aggregate demand. Okay, so that's the framework. That's how I think of things, and I hope that's been insightful for you too as we go through what's next. Okay, so let's look at some employment numbers by industry. And the headline I have up here is that the pandemic recession is a leisure and hospitality crisis. Now, I'm sure you're all aware of this. We were just talking about restaurants for a while. We know tourism, hotels have been hit really hard, and this shows it. This chart shows it. So what I've got up here is payroll employment, an index for, oops, I've got it labeled wrong. It says for US states, it's actually for the entire country by industry. And what's up here is I'm comparing where we were in February 2020 to where we were in April and where we are in September. Okay, so which is, I think we actually have October numbers now, but they didn't make it into this chart, unfortunately. But the story is going to be pretty much the same. So you can see on the I've ranked industries, high-level industries by how big their drop was from February to April. So that's the blue dots, and this is in percent terms. If we look at the far left, it's the leisure and hospitality sector. The blue dot shows that compared to where it was in February 2020, employment in leisure and hospitality was 49% lower than it was in February 2020 in April. So that means that over 2 months, basically half of leisure and hospitality employment went away. Now, there's been a very large bounce back. 30. We're back to down. Well, it's still extremely low, right? We're back up to 80, which means that as of September, leisure and hospitality was still missing 20% of the workers that it had in February 2020. The other big sector that got hit really hard and that's still struggling to some extent was the other services category. And the big one there was personal care services. So hair salons, nail salons, things like that. Those got hit especially hard. Although as of September, they're back to being kind of in line with the rest of the other sectors in the economy. The one that's continued to struggle, manufacturing, I know, Rockford and the rest of the Midwest, we're a manufacturing hub we're the manufacturing hub of the US. Manufacturing's come back some. The other ones that didn't get hit as hard, but it's actually come down more is the mining and logging. So this is oil and gas. Think of the oil and gas, and we already had supply problems, or at least from an oil producer's perspective, there were supply problems prior to this, where there was just a big, huge supply of oil on the market, and with the big pullback in travel, it's created just a real dearth of demand for oil and gas, and that's continued to play out in the oil and gas sector, even though the initial shock wasn't as bad as other sectors. But overall, the way I interpret this chart is that the pandemic recession, again, it's really a leisure and hospitality crisis, where that crisis is dragging down all the other sectors to a large extent. And when are we going to be out of this? Well, we're going to be out of this, I think. And I always forget to say this at the beginning. These are my views, not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago or the Federal Reserve System. These are my views. So I always try to preface my comments with I think this and I think that, not the Fed says this, the Fed says that. So anyway, I think that when are we going to be out of this? We're going to be out of this when the leisure and hospitality sector can largely go back to normal on a capacity level. And when people want to go back to restaurants because they feel safe. That's when I think we're going to be out of this. I think that's what everything hinges on. Now, a couple other notes I have here. One is that the recession is also speeding structural changes. So we're seeing, great example, this happens with every recession, definitely happening this one too. A great example is e-commerce, where we bought today for our kitten something on Amazon to keep the pull strings for our blinds away from him so he doesn't hurt himself or something. That's the fear, apparently. So, but we bought it on Amazon. I have a PetSmart that's 3 blocks down the street, but we're buying it on Amazon just because we can, because that's what's already was happening, but also because it's one fewer trip into a store, where it's I don't personally feel a huge risk going into the PetSmart, but it's still one fewer trip to the store. So that's that's another thing that's going on. And then my final bullet point here is that, again, manufacturing has not been the hardest hit. And I think a big part of that is that manufacturing has been able to, by and large, solve the capacity problems that the pandemic presents. Not completely. Jared mentioned supply chain problems. I'm sure many of you who are in manufacturing, the people that I already talked to in manufacturing, we're continuing to hear about headaches related to supply chain. We've been hearing about challenges in keeping workers safe, but by far the challenges seem smaller to me for manufacturers compared to what restaurants and other types of leisure and hospitality businesses are facing in terms of solving the supply side problems. But the thing with manufacturing, and this is definitely the case for Rockford, since you all are really concentrated in durable goods manufacturing. Durable goods are things that people buy as investment goods, by definition. And the case with every recession, including this one, is that businesses and households, even in spite of all the cash they have, you're still reluctant to make big investments because there's a lot of uncertainty. And so that's something where manufacturing, it's getting hit about as hard as it got hit during the Great Recession, which was really bad. But it's not one of the hardest hit sectors this time, and I think that's because, again, it solved the capacity problem. But I also don't expect manufacturing to come back faster than the rest of the economy, simply because investment always seems to be a drag. Investment always drags during a recession, and so that's my take on what's going to be what manufacturers have to look forward to over the next year or so as we wait for the public health crisis to be solved. Okay, so let me now turn, I said this is about Illinois. Let me now, I'm an outlook for Illinois. So let me now turn to some work I've been doing in my role as kind of a big part of my job is looking at state and local economic data. And so basically what I've been spending the summer and the fall thinking about is trying to understand this chart right here. So this is in another employment index. This time it is actually for US states as opposed to for the country as a whole. And what I've got up here is it's actually for all 50 states plus DC. I've got an index. This is a time series where I've set 100 to be February 2020 again. And this shows you how things have played out across the 50 states. I've put Illinois in blue and the US as a whole in black. You can see there's a lot of differences in experience. Now, every state lost a ton of employment from February to April, but some lost more than others, and some have come back faster. Illinois' experience has been pretty much in line with that of the US. Illinois has been pretty average, and you're going to see this in the next few charts that I show you, that Illinois is actually, a big part of this was to try to understand, to tell a story for places like Illinois and other states in our district in terms of what's happened. Because Illinois has been so kind of close to the US, it's actually not that much of that interesting of a story for Illinois as it is for Michigan, for example, which was actually, it's at the very bottom there. It had the biggest drop of any state from February to April. So again, for the US as a whole, and Illinois was a little bit better, the US, just to interpret the chart here, the US lost about 15% of its employment from February to April. And as of September, about half of that had come back. We saw some more job gains in October. We haven't gotten the state level data for October yet, but for the US as a whole, we saw some more gains, but we're still well below 100. The gains again are slowing. You can kind of see the slowdown here a little bit better now that the time series isn't as compressed as that first chart I showed you. Okay, so what I've been spending a lot of my time doing is just trying to understand why some states did worse than others in the initial drop, and then what's behind their recoveries. So here are my explanations. These are the things I've been focusing on. The first one, of course, is a response to what happened. Like what happened. We had a pandemic. So what happened in response to a pandemic? Well, people pull back. People and businesses pull back in capacity, and people pull back and households pull back in consumption to keep people safe. So there are many different ways that this can affect the state's economy. The first most obvious one is just the intensity of the outbreak. The idea I have here is that states that had bigger outbreaks should have seen bigger drops. And if you didn't get your outbreak under control, or you had a subsequent outbreak, you should see perhaps a slower recovery. There's also this question of how concerned people are about how dangerous the virus is. And, I don't want to get political in this talk at all. That's not the Fed's job. That's not my job today. But one of the things we noticed that actually, and I'll show you this, appears to be playing out in how the economy has been going is that Republicans tend to be less concerned about the virus, how dangerous the virus is, than Democrats. So there's some polls out there that show this. And so one of the things I consider, and I'll show you the results from this later, is in just a bit, is how Republican leaning or Democrat leaning a state is. And I use a poll from 2018. And then another thing that can happen is so that the intensity of the outbreak and this differences in how concerned people are about how dangerous the virus is, those can affect actually, let me add one thing for the intensity of the outbreak is that I also consider how bad things are in neighboring states. So, but the idea here is that people are pulling back because they're concerned about their safety. Another thing that can happen, and this actually primarily matters for Nevada, and I'll show you this as well, is that industry mix matters. This is the standard explanation that regional economists give for any story related to what's going on in a local area's economy. First, you look at what are the major industries in that area. And, this was a leisure and hospitality crisis. And so Nevada was a state that got hit the hardest because of its industry mix. It didn't actually have a huge outbreak at first, but being a huge leisure and hospitality center, same with Hawaii, those states got hit even though their outbreaks weren't that large, at least initially. Okay, so that's kind of, think of that as like, that's both the supply and demand side, but that's voluntary changes that people are making. There's also involuntary changes that came from states and local governments implementing stay-at-home orders. So there's actually some interesting variations, some interesting differences across states in how strict their stay-at-home orders were in terms of like what industries the stay-at-home orders applied to. Michigan, again, a good example here. They shut down the construction industry for basically a month in the spring. Illinois, that didn't happen. Things like that can also affect, of course, economic activity. The final thing I consider, and then I'm going to show you the results, is the long run employment growth rate in a state. So some states were growing faster prior to the pandemic recession than others. These states are primarily in the West and the South, not in the Midwest. No state, Illinois and Chicago, of course, are famous for, at least among those of us who live here, who track state and local stories pretty closely. Illinois is famous for being a population loser kind of over the last 10 years. We'll see what the census tells us. But Illinois is not alone in that. The rest of the Midwest, pretty much everywhere except for, I think, college towns and Indianapolis and Columbus, Ohio, and a few other exceptions, have been seeing declining population. It's not just Illinois, although the fiscal situation in Illinois isn't helping. It's not just, Illinois is not alone in this. Okay, so I consider that whether long-run employment growth rates either helped make the decline less worse, or whether it's helped the recovery go faster. Okay, and so what I do is I put all of these different explanations into what's known as a regression model. This is a standard. This is what you get taught in Econometrics 101, and the idea is to just kind of look at all these different explanations and see which ones have a relatively stronger explanations, which ones matter the most. All right, so let's go to the results for the decline. All right, so this is an extremely busy chart. I've got 48 states up. I had to drop Alaska and Hawaii because they don't have any neighbors. And then I had to drop DC because I didn't have data for everything for DC. So we've got 40, the lower 48 are in here. Illinois is right in the middle, as I mentioned before. So let me take a little time to walk you through this chart. The first thing that I want you to look at, let me just note too that I changed it to a logarithmic scale. Don't worry about that. The logarithmic scale is basically the same as a percent change. It's just a little cleaner for doing the data analysis. But you interpret these, say if you see 0.25, that means about a 25% drop. Minus 0.25 is about a 25% drop. So the first thing to look at with this chart are the black diamonds. That's what actually happened. So I've sorted again by, I've sorted this by the ranking of states by which ones fell the most and which ones fell the least. So Michigan's at the far left, it fell the most. It had roughly about a, by the logarithmic scale, it had about a 0.27% drop in employment, which is about 25% drop in employment. Michigan was the worst. Illinois, again, kind of in the middle. That's what the black dots, that's what the black diamonds are. The bars are taking all the different explanations I just went through and trying to say for each state, which one does the model attribute those explanations to for a given state. So let's do Nevada. Nevada is the third from the left. And let's focus on Nevada because I think it's an interesting story. So, sorry, Illinois is just not that interesting. It's just average in this case, which maybe that feels a little bit good. So let's look at Nevada. So it was the third worst in terms of its drop. Let's start with the blue bar. The blue bar is the average change. This is the average change across all states. And so what my model can do is it tells you everything relative to the average. So outbreak size of nearby states, all these things are relative to the average. So Nevada had a below average, or had a bigger than average drop in employment by far. And so what made Nevada's drop in employment bigger than average? The first explanation, the red bar, which is basically non-existent for Nevada, is outbreak size. This is saying, so if you have a red bar that's making a negative contribution that's below the blue bar, that means that the outbreak was below or was bigger than average for that state. Now, Nevada didn't have much of an outbreak, at least initially from February to April. And Nevada's neighboring states, that's kind of the olive color, the outbreak size of neighboring states. That's the olive color. Nevada was surrounded by states that had kind of above average outbreak, or their outbreak sizes were smaller than average. So what that means is that Nevada actually got a positive contribution to its employment numbers, about say 0.02. So Nevada's employment, according to the model, would have been 0.02 worse if it hadn't been surrounded by states that generally had small outbreaks. So let's then go on to the yellow bar. So the yellow bar says that Nevada had a stricter than average stay-at-home order. That's what I mean by share not allowed to work. It had a stricter than average stay-at-home order, particularly because they basically shut down the casinos for a month or two. I think they opened them up in June, I was reading. So they were shut down for a couple months. So that's pretty strict for Nevada if you have to if basically the casinos are shut. All right. Industry mix is the next one. This is where Nevada got hit really hard. its industry mix is very concentrated in leisure and hospitality, and as a result, it had a huge drop related to that. The model says that about 10 percentage points of Nevada's drop can be explained by it having a really unfavorable industry mix. Next one here is relative support for the GOP. Okay, so this is my the way I interpret this is that states where there's more support for the GOP, people tend to take the risks from the virus less seriously. And so for Nevada, according to the data I had from 2018, it skewed slightly toward the GOP in terms of its favorability. And so, or I'm sorry, it skewed slightly Democrat. And so that means that roughly another 0.03% or so of, roughly 3% or so of Nevada's, oh wait, I'm sorry, I'm looking at Vermont. It's a very small number. So Nevada, as we know, skews just slightly Democrat. And so there was maybe a slightly lower, slightly bigger drop for Nevada because of the, at least this is a proxy for how seriously the virus, the health risks of the virus are taken. Okay, then long run growth rate. Nevada was growing a little bit slower than normal, than average prior to the Great Recession. And so that pulled it down a little bit, but the long run growth rate really doesn't seem to matter much for any state in explaining the downturn. Now the final thing here is the purple bar, and that's not I've labeled it not explained by the model. And what that means is that there are other things going on here that I didn't include. And a big one, if you look at Michigan, Michigan's a state where this model did the worst. Michigan had a relatively big outbreak. It had a relatively strict stay-at-home order, but there's a big part of Michigan's drop that just can't be explained by the model. And the way I think of this is, I actually think a big part of this is that the way I calculate industry mix, it's not precise enough. And I'm not sure if I can make it more precise really that easily. Michigan, of course, is a big auto industry state. And I know that you all in Rockford are a big auto folks too. You probably know about the shutdown that happened to pretty much the auto industry shut down at the initial part of the pandemic. And what happens and I think this is a big part of what explains why Michigan's employment dropped by so much. But the problem with my industry mix variable is that I'm mixing aerospace and auto together because that's just how the data are. And aerospace didn't get hit as hard. Aerospace got hit kind of an average for manufacturing compared to the auto industry that just got hit really hard. Okay, so let me try to wrap this up a little bit. So let me just show you the results for the recovery, and what this the main thing that basically what happened during the recovery is that everything bounced back. That's pretty much what we've seen. So I added another variable here called the decline size. So Michigan is now on the far right. Michigan has had the biggest recovery relative to its drop. So that means, its employment growth since April has been the biggest of any state. And the big reason for that is simply because it had the biggest decline. So there's a big bounce back that's going on in the recovery, where the states that had the biggest drop have also had the biggest recovery. Illinois, again, it's a little bit more to the left, but it's still pretty average. Michigan had a huge recovery, and again, that's because it just had a big drop. So if we adjust for all these other explanations, if you take out anything related to the initial drop, what we're then looking at is kind of what's happened since April. So we've seen for oil industry states that because the oil industries really employment's continued to drop for those industries, or for in the oil industry states have had slower recoveries. Another thing to note, and I'm going to move on here a little bit quickly, so I think I'll send my charts to Anna, and she can share them with anyone who wants them if you want to look at this more closely. Another thing to note is that at least we're going through a really big outbreak right now, but the outbreak, at least through September, really didn't seem to affect activity that much. States that had bigger recoveries from an outbreak did get big, so Michigan got a little bit of boost because it had a big outbreak. And so then its big outbreak went away, and that helped push up employment, push up growth. But states that had kind of second wave outbreaks, their employment growth didn't really slow according to this model as a result of that. What really seems, aside from the rebound, what really seems to be explaining differences across states here is relative support for GDP or for the GOP. That seems to be, at least if you look at the size of the bars, aside from kind of the wine-colored bar, the orange one is the other one that seems to be making bigger contributions. And it seems that once you adjust for kind of the rebound, it's really states where there apparently is less concern about safety for the virus, keeping safe from the virus, have seen bigger recoveries. But even as I say that, note that like these bars are pretty small compared to the whole. So we're seeing some faster growth in states where there's this question about, is there a trade-off between the economic recovery and reopening? It's a big question, and I think on the one side there are people who say, if we just shut down the economy completely shut down for a month, then we could reopen entirely. And then there are other folks who say, and that the fact that we're not really shutting down completely means that we're slowing the recovery because we keep having to hold back as we try to deal with the virus. The other side is saying, let's just open up because we need people to get back to work. And so what we're seeing is that, yes, there is some boost from having the perspective of, let's just reopen because people need to get back to work. But it's not enough to actually fill this huge hole. Leisure and hospitality is still down in every state, still down by a huge amount. And from what I can tell, it's unlikely to come back truly come back until we've got the virus under control. Okay, so let's see here. I think we're doing all right on time. This is I advertised this earlier, and this is results from our latest survey. Where one of the questions I ask is, when do you think we're going to get back to our pre-pandemic activity level? So this is just the idea of when do we think we're going to. GDP was 100 in February. When are we going to be back to GDP at 100 again? And according to our survey participants, slightly under half think we're going to be back there by the end of 2021. Slightly more than half think it's going to be later than that. And excuse me, about 15% think it's going to be even after 2023. The FOMC, that's the Fed's decision-making group, forecasts are similar. Kind of a end of 2021, first half of 2022 is kind of where I think, and I'll show you another forecast in the next slide, and then I'll be done, is kind of where people think when people think we're gonna be back to normal. And the big questions are, the big question is, when is the public health problem gonna be solved? All right, and that's just, again, it's great news that it seems like we're gonna get a really effective vaccine soon. At least very soon compared to how long it typically takes vaccines to be developed. There's this other question and I think, a few months ago I think people would have thought things would be worse now, given the kind of the drying up of federal government support. But even so, I think the way that our president, Charlie, puts it is that he has in his forecast for us getting back to GDP normal to GDP where it was by early 2022 is that there needs to be more, is that his forecast includes the assumption that there's going to be more federal government support coming down the line. And implicit in what he's saying there is that if there wasn't more federal government support, he thinks it would take longer. So those are the big questions. What is going to happen with federal government support, and of course, the number one question is when are we going to be able to go about our lives without having to worry about getting the coronavirus? And oh, I got a plug here. There's my email address. Take a quick picture of this screen to send it to me, or it's just my name, thomas.walstrom@shy.frb.org. If you want to participate in our survey, I'd love to hear from you and be able to share that information with the decision makers at the Fed. Okay, last slide. This actually isn't a Fed forecast. This is a forecast from a leading private forecaster, Macro Advisors, for what's going to happen. And the headline I put up here is that this recession is expected to be shorter. Well, actually, at this point, we know the recession is over. The recession is over. We're growing again. Even with this big outbreak we're going through, again, this is my opinion, I think we might see a slowdown in growth and continue to see a slowdown in growth, but I actually would be a little bit surprised to see a decline in GDP given the size of this outbreak, which it really is rivaling the from what I can tell, rivaling the initial outbreak, except that it's going thankfully it's not as skewed toward older folks as the initial outbreak appears to be. So anyway, so this recession is shorter, but it was much deeper than the Great Recession. You can see that here in this chart. And the good news, I think the good news is that we do kind of have the expectation that it's going to be a shorter recovery. So macro advisors, they did a good job of forecasting we had about a 10% drop from the fourth quarter of 2019 through the second quarter of 2020. GDP dropped by about 10%. And then growth returned. So we had a 3-quarter drop. We had 3 quarters of GDP dropping, and the expectation is that according to macro advisors, they think we're going to get back to GDP back to 100 by the fourth quarter of 2021. So that's an 8-quarter recovery. Now compare that to the Great Recession. It was a much shallower drop, though still very deep compared to previous recessions. It was a 4% drop. It took 7 quarters. It was 7 quarters of GDP dropping before the recovery started, and it was 14 quarters. So what is that? 3.5 years of recovery before we got back to GDP being where it was. So 3.5 years versus 2 years of recovery. I'll take the 2-year recovery. I think I mean, it's not heartening because we're still in the middle of things, right? We still got 2021 to go through. But hopefully 2022 will be back to where we were. Now, one thing to note in terms of getting back to GDP being where it was, that doesn't mean unemployment's going to be back to where it was. Unemployment's going to take longer to come down probably, simply because it's not like technological growth has stopped. So GDP growing, part of it, you can see there's this upward trend that's from technological growth. So if you want to draw the line to where we get back to, kind of full potential GDP, that's going to be more like 2023. Okay, so I think I'm done. I'm just going to conclude, and I can go over past noon if you all want, if there are a lot of questions. Here are my takeaways. We're going through a very difficult public health and economic shock. I think that I have that thought saved for the third bullet. There's still a lot of uncertainty. So there was an extreme amount of uncertainty, in the spring and in the summer. It's been dying down, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. Still not clear, when there's going to be widespread availability of a vaccine. So I think there's, the stock market seems to be, much more certain about the future than it was maybe six months ago. But there's still a lot of uncertainty, I'd say, and I think it comes down to what's the path of the virus. I think, in my view, I think I've said this enough times already, but I'll say it again. Our success at controlling the virus is going to determine when the economy recovers. And if this outbreak going on right now, if we have another one before we get a vaccine, that's, I think, going to slow the recovery. But all that said, I think there is hope that the recovery is going to be faster than that of the Great Recession. And with that, I can take any questions people have.
Well, thank you so much. And we do have some questions. That was a
Great,
very insightful presentation. Thank you. We do have time, Tom, for a few questions. I
great.
will start with the first question here. How is our economy recovery doing compared to other nations or countries?
That's a great question. And I don't actually, I haven't paid close attention to the data for other countries. So I'm going to be only able to speak at an extremely high level. My understanding is that, again, and this seems in line with my story that I've already been telling, East Asia has come back faster. China reported, for example, you can't ever completely believe the numbers coming out of China. You should be cautious with them, but they're back to growth. They were back to growth in the third quarter. So I think in general, the countries, East Asian countries where they've been able to really tamp down the virus, they've been able to come back faster than us. They're still, again, this is a global economy and they're still struggling because the rest of the world is struggling with the virus, but they've come back a little faster. Europe's, as I know the data at a very high level, Europe's recovery was slower, and I think it's going to continue to be slower because they're also dealing with this kind of fall outbreak that we're going through. And that's about all I've got on that front.
Thank you. Next question. The housing market seems untouched by this or even stimulated by this. Is this true, and how does impact communities who may be experiencing a housing shortage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's another great one to contrast with the previous recession where it was really it was a housing driven recession to a large extent. So yeah, I was surprised at how much housing came back, but I think this is one where we've seen that that they've kind of solved the supply side problem, right? I mean, the housing market pretty much shut down for a couple months, but that didn't, but they figured out people have figured out how to sell houses as even though, figured out that you don't need to do much in-person stuff, this interaction to sell houses. And so that sector has been able to come back. There's the low interest rates, and I'm guessing all of you have either refinanced or if you purchase a new house, you're very happy with the rate you've gotten. Low interest rates are helping that too. And then there's perhaps the longer run question um, of this movement from people maybe a little bit younger than me, but millennials. I'm right on the border of millennial and Gen X. Millennials finally buying houses. Maybe this is pushing. This is a story I've heard that seems reasonable. This is pushing some of the big burst is people pushing, deciding now, okay, now's the time to buy a house. I'm I don't since space at home, especially work from home space is very valuable. You can see I've got I'm in the playroom of our house. That's my office too. So there's some costumes in the back. But I've actually got a separate room. So all those things I can think of are kind of there's some long run and short run stuff that's pushing up the real estate market. It's nice to see, except for you're right. You mentioned this person did mention the affordability concerns, and my understanding is that a lot of that is driven by really expensive materials right now. But I think it's also the case that it's just expensive to build houses these days. And that seems like a longer run thing from what I can tell that might not be going away. Yeah, I guess I'll move on from that question. I don't have any. I think at least in the Midwest, there's much less of a affordability concern than there is on the coasts. But even so, new building is still like something that you have to that's where it's expensive, and and the availability of new starter homes just seems like something that's been really hard for home builders to do, even in the Midwest. So I think that's all I've
Thank
got
you.
on that. Yep.
So we have this, so will this, here's the next question. Will this spur the reshoring of manufacturing for a long term once the pandemic is over?
That's a great question. And you know what, that reminds me, I forgot to talk about the tariffs and trade situation, which I know that was something that got mentioned here. Um, I think that it's the trade and tariff situation at the moment is, I think, I'm guessing that those of you who are in manufacturing are seeing it more than most. Um, but of course, it's still like kind of a secondary concern from solving the pandemic problem. But then there is this question of the longer term thing. What happens with the global economy in terms of trade? Are we going to get back to kind of the regime? Maybe now that it's pretty clear that we're going to have a new president. Um, how much are we going to get back to the kind of the trade regime that we had prior to Trump, prior to the pandemic? And the answer that I have is I have no idea. I'm not sure. I'm guessing that um, that we're never going to be the same. That's my personal guess, but I don't know how much different things are going to be. I think there's so much that with a global economy that binds countries together, that it's even even if there's interest in kind of decoupling, it's it's I expect it will be very difficult. So reshoring, I think that yeah, I don't I guess I think that there are reasons that we should expect some reshoring to happen. And I think this was already going on, is things like, as China's been getting richer and incomes have been going up in China, it's made it so that the labor cost differences between China and the US are not as different. And that's definitely something that pushes in favor of reshoring. I think, to me, the bigger question for manufacturing going forward is, you know, um, you know, it, it's does the long run has the is the long run structural change in manufacturing that we've been seeing over decades going to continue? Where like in the 50s, like 30% of workers were in manufacturing. Now we're down to about 10%. This is for the U.S. as a whole. I know in Rockford it's much higher percent. But this is a long-run structural change that I think the share of the workers that are in manufacturing has been pretty stable actually over the last, say, decade, but it's still low, and it's a question of um, are we going to see any recovery in that? And I'm not sure. I think the thing is that if you ask me what's behind that long-run kind of Rust Belt structural change in manufacturing, I think the big thing is that um, is a story of economic growth and kind of a post-industrial story where as people get richer, we just we spend less on things and spend more on services. And we've been seeing that for decades. And it's just hard for me to see that we are going to be spending a greater share of our income as our incomes continue to grow on things. Whether it's just hard for me to see that overarching trend is going to change. So I think that was an answer to the question. I hope that was a somewhat satisfying answer to the question. Um, and I can go on the next
Well,
one.
thank you. Yes, thank you. We have time for two more questions. The next question is, realistically, do you expect to see a migration from larger cities to smaller cities as work from home becomes more common long term? And I
Yeah,
like this
okay.
question, Tom. I do like this question because it seems as people take time to drive around the Midwest and go through smaller towns, it just seems to be more activity in smaller towns.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, I think the best answer is I don't know. But if you force me to speculate, I think um, I think you can see uh, you can see that prices in big cities, especially like in, say, this isn't the Midwest, this isn't Chicago versus Rockford, this is New York City versus the Midwest, or the West Coast, the coast versus the middle of the country. But you can see rents have gone down in New York and San Francisco, but they were ridiculously high. And I think so. My first thought on this is that the Midwest as a whole is going to benefit, has benefited and will continue to benefit from the coasts not solving their housing supply problems. There's just great demand to live on the coast because incomes are so high there, and a lot of those incomes are being shoveled into rent instead of into disposable income because housing is just not, the housing supply is not growing fast enough to meet the demand, and that's making the Midwest and cities in the Midwest and other parts of the country relatively good value. Now, then there's the question of, say, Chicago versus Rockford. I think, from what I can tell, there are certain, but I think this is perhaps a longer term trend already. There are certain types of jobs that, that are not knowledge-driven jobs where you need to be in where there's a big benefit to being in a bigger city. That maybe won't be in the bigger cities, and where they're either going to move those jobs to places where the commute's shorter or to the suburbs or to smaller cities. I think that was already kind of going on. What I don't see changing is that, for whatever reason, and this is kind of I guess an urban economics 101 story, is that for whatever reason, people where there's a huge benefit to being able to quickly share knowledge, face-to-face interactions just are more efficient, and not just face-to-face interactions, but being able to bump into people and have random conversations. I think people have been trying to kind of recreate this during the pandemic and the Zoom era, but I think it's just not the same. And so that is where I'm a skeptic of kind of the knowledge-driven occupations not needing to be in a centralized location. But then aside from that, yeah, perhaps a lot of businesses will learn as a result of the pandemic that there are certain parts of their operations that don't need to be where they don't need to pay rent, office, to have fixed office space for them. And I think that at least on the margins, we should expect prices to change as a result, that prices are relative, maybe not population change so much, but that prices are cheaper relatively lower in central cities relative to suburbs, and in relatively higher in smaller cities relative to big cities, that those relative prices are going to change some. I hope that was a decent answer.
Thank you. And this next question, I'll ask it, but I do think that the answer to the question that you just gave, I think this will also cover this question as well, but I'll ask it anyway. Question
Sure.
is, how is rural being affected compared to metro areas, since rural is older and more leisure hospitality oriented?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have I guess, unfortunately, most of my answers are I don't know to this. Um, I think, yeah, I think, again, this is another one of these kind of longer run structural changes that we will continue to see as technology continues its steady pace forward, is that the kinds of activities, that the kinds of jobs that we do in the modern age or this isn't the modern age anymore, that's the wrong word. The kinds of jobs we do now are jobs where you know we benefit from being nearby other people in terms of being able to be productive. And I think that kind of long run thing continues to not be to suggest that rural areas are not going to, that are continue to see people kind of leaving rural areas. The current situation, I think, it's interesting that, it depends on what type of rural area you're talking about. If it's manufacturing driven, of course, those rural areas are going to be struggling. If it's agriculture, it seems like the government's got a very nice, again, this is my view, not the view of the Fed. The government's got a pretty good support system for farmers, regardless of what regardless of what the current crop conditions are. So the really ag-driven spaces, unless you got, there was the derecho in Iowa that, if you're in that space, things aren't great right now. But overall, it seems like the farmers our incomes are going to be decent this year, actually. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for the answers to Q&A. That was very, very nice. Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for the excellent presentation. We greatly appreciate your time and expertise. We're very fortunate to have you and the resources of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago available to us all. Thank you to all that attended. We hope you found value in today's presentation and you can take what you have learned here today with you back to your workplace. I just want to follow up on some quick housekeeping before we end today's session. We have some webinars coming up. November 17th, we have Your EDC, Moving Our Region Forward. And we have another webinar on November 19th, Ed Talks, Manage Your Brand. For more information on these webinars and other RAEDC resources, please visit the Rockford Area Economic Development Council website. Again, thank you to all that attended today's very informative and insightful presentation. We appreciate your support. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.